I smell Polish representation in nerd culture. This calls for the Gopnik suit.
Hello again, everybody, and yes, I know what you're saying. Didn't you just go over painting a miniature from the Scythe game? Well, absolutely I did, but this one was a little bit detailed. Today, because I'm bored and just don't feel like doing anything except mindless work, I'm going to be trying out something a little bit different with each of the mechs from the Scythe game. As should be apparent from the fact that I have painted these giant orc mechs before, and the fact that I run an orc army made almost entirely of Killicans, Death Dreads, and of course my Gorkanaut, I love the concept of giant robots, especially in a fantasy or sci-fi setting, and it just so happens that Scythe has them too. The only difference being that Scythe has giant robots with guns in an alternate history setting, which is something that I have not addressed before, not even in the slightest. And of course, since this all takes place in a setting somewhere around Eastern Europe, I plan on continuing my theme of being extremely Slav while painting these. I've got my jar of finished kumquat from last time. It's a nice strawberry and blackberry and sage kumquat to calm me down while painting. And just to steady my hand, and to steady my hand, I've got myself some plain and in no way altered dark kvass. Let's get to it. You know, I never thought about it before this video, but does anybody else notice that, when you're doing your priming ritual for painting, you actually end up looking a lot like you're dancing hard bus? I know this sounds silly, and you guys never really get to see this part of it, but I cannot describe how good it feels, unironically, to have my hands soaked in primer again. This is a feeling I've been missing for the past year. But greasy hands aside, let's get to it. The first thing you have to do with everything pertaining to history, even alternate history, is a little bit of research. Now, in order to make these tanks feel like they're part of the environment, I looked up what tanks were made of in the 1920s, which, it's good that they're made out of steel, but I don't like the homogeny of just steel plates. So let's look up what people painted their tanks like back in 1920. We'll look at this little site over here, which in turn tells me exactly what everybody painted their tanks. Not just the Poles, as you see here, but what the Russians, what Prussia did, or rather the German Empire, or what the Nordic kingdoms did. And if you don't have a source at all, you can just get creative. But for right now, let's focus on some Polania Republic mech paint. Now, this one's going to be the basic layout of what I do for every mech in this line. In other words, concoct your shade of drab, in my case currently, this green and brown that the Poles used to paint their tanks in the 1920s. Cover the entire thing in this mixture, then once that's done, give it a dry brush and concoct a mixture for, say, some rust or wear and tear that you'll dry brush over that. Add in some small details after you're done with this with a fine point brush. And after that, you'll get it looking fairly acceptable. And if you got a problem with me being this simplistic with it, did you perhaps switch your compote water with your painting water like I certainly didn't? Yeah. Well, anyways, the next mech is going to be the Saxony mech, and I'm painting that a rich greenish blue like the German Empire tanks of old. And because the primary source one had a bit of rust at the bottom, I added the rust. Oh, and a Prussian flag, just for good measure. Now the next one is going to be the Rusviet mech. Remember the Polania mech and how awesome that looked? This thing just looks like a jar of kumquat grew legs and scythes. It's hilarious. Oh well. Well, for this one, I just did a gray-green scheme like an old Soviet tank, and I added the rust on the blades. And of course, some 3 stripes for Adidas. Now we can almost just skip right over the next one because all the Nordic kingdoms one was a bunch of white metal with a little trim of rusted copper on the side. Nothing fancy if you've done it before. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's just address what I'm doing here. Unlike any of the other ones, the Crimean Khanate does not have an actual tank color scheme in history. I had to completely go out on a limb and trust my instincts. My instincts told me that this should be brass or bronze.
And to do that, all I did was prime green dry brush gold. That's it. Well, now let's take all of these finished products over to quality control and see what the expert has to say. Come on, kiddie, you know you like the Polish one the best. Come on. I can't stay mad at you, you're just so cute.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our little experiment. I truly enjoyed painting everything from the world of Scythe. As I said, it's my first time doing alternate history of this caliber, so it really was a challenge trying to reel in my instincts and keep it to the drab colors. This little experiment of ours only cost me maybe 4 hours and my Adidas pants and the half a pot of paint that spilled on my Adidas pants. But other than that, the pros outweigh the cons. And so I will go into next episode continuing in the alternate history vein, but we're going to leave the world of Scythe behind and instead focus on the great breach between our world and the world of Malifaux. So it's Vidania, do widzenia, stay cheeky breaky.